about 6 weeks ago or so, it was almost the end of fall. It was before winter fell so hard that it broke its slave and couldn't get up again to leave. Came to church, and when I got out of my car, there was this tremendous racket. It sounded like somebody in front of a microphone rustling paper. It was so loud. And I looked around, and I didn't see what it was, and I didn't notice until I looked up again to the trees around, and there were thousands of starlings packed on every limb of every tree surrounding the church. And as I watched, there was all of this noise, and then all of a sudden there was a momentary silence, like someone catching their breath. It was just like, you're talking and talking and talking, and there was a silence. And then 1,000 or so of these birds catapulted from their perches into the air all at once. And it wasn't just from one tree, it was from a tree across the street and over here, and sections of the trees, and some limbs emptied, and all at once they flew into the sky, leaving the other other birds just sitting in the trees. And they shot into the air in a gigantic flying carpet of movement and feathers and flesh, and they rose and they dove and they swirled as a single organism floating through the sky. They did this for a minute or so, until just as suddenly they returned to their perches. Once they returned, they again raised this cacophony of noise, of chatter for a couple of minutes. And then another flying carpet of feathers launched into the sky from a completely different section of the trees, and went out and completed the same circuit of aerial mayhem until they too returned. And this went on for maybe 10 minutes of different segments. Just, I don't know how they did it. Launching into the air as a single unit. And then they all gathered back in the trees and they chattered for a while, and then all at once they all whooshed, swirled up into the air and disappeared into the distance. Now, when I say that the birds acted as a single organism, I'm not underestimating it. It's not like they were synchronized. It's not like one did something and the others responded, but it's like the birds over here left the trees at the same time that the birds over here did. And there'd be thousands of birds in the air, and the birds over here would turn at the same time that the birds over here would turn. And it was amazing. Couldn't see how they did it. There's a researcher at the University of Utah named Wayne Potts, who's studied flocks of birds like this. And one of the things that he's determined is that these flocks will turn from one side to the other within about 20 milliseconds of one another. 20 milliseconds isn't very long. With photos and experiments, he determined this. And then he took individual birds into the laboratory and tested them. And what he discovered was that for a bird to respond to an external stimulus took 60 to 80 milliseconds, like 3 or 4 times longer than it took these birds to flow as a single organism. It seemed like there was a way that they were together, that there was a field that the birds operated within that enabled them to act simultaneously. British biologist Rupert Sheldrake calls this phenomena morphic resonance. It's the sense that there is something that happens between the individuals of the species that creates something more than the individuals. It's fascinating to see. Sheldrake has come up with examples of it throughout nature. But what fascinates me is that it also seems to work in the human experience too, that there seems to be this kind of resonance that happens in the human family. I've talked to musicians who have spoken of audiences that they've developed a resonance with. I don't know if you've ever been to concerts where this has happened, rock concerts, where the audience and the performers just feed off of one another, and it's like they both get energy. And there's a reciprocating exchange of energy that creates a peak experience for all of them, musicians and audience alike. It's like musicians and audience all seem to be in the flow together. I've experienced this a couple times in leading training events and in speaking, and it's like there's an energy that is almost palpable that exists between people. I think I've spoken before of it, but I spoke once at an anniversary celebration of an African American church in the Seattle area. And as I began to talk, I said, I hear you folks are willing to give a speaker a little help. And the response was a chorus of amens, and a couple preach it brothers, and speak it, and say it. And with that affirmation, it was like my nervousness just melted. I went, oh, okay, I can be with these people. And for the next half hour or so, the congregation and I just carried on this wonderful dialogue of speaking and response, and speaking and response, and speaking and response that had an increasing vitality and intensity to it. I mean, really fun. Really fun. I'm sure a lot of you have experienced the same kind of thing. It's a common thing in meditation groups that when we join together as a group in meditation, that there's something happens there that is more powerful than when we sit by ourselves. Or in musical groups where if doing chanting together is again a way of a resonance develops between people. Happens, not just at that small local level, but I think it happens at a large level too, at a worldwide level. happens not only positively, but it can happen negatively too. If you've ever watched movies of Hitler speaking to these huge crowds, Hitler and the crowds are obviously in this resonance, feeding off of one another. In that case, it was a resonance that was working for destruction and for evil. One way of thinking about this kind of resonance, Gustav Jung, the psychologist, suggested that there are a whole array of fields, of energy fields that you might say that we operate within, that he called the collective unconscious. And he was essentially saying that there are themes and streams of commonality that flow through the human spirit, which we all participate in. And these themes and these streams seem to be universal across human cultures, although each culture might express it a little differently. The figure of the Madonna, for instance, it's in Catholic Christianity. It's also expressed in other cultures, in other religions. This feminine face of the holy is this common theme, we have common urges that we can identify. And the point here is that while we like to think of ourselves as individuals, the point is that we're all connected to one another in ways that aren't really readily apparent to us. We participate one with another in a stew of interconnected forces that we can't see, because these forces are like the air we breathe. It's just so much a part of us. The power that we have as individuals and as humans is that we both operate within these fields, and we have the capacity to feed or diminish that which we participate in. When Martin Luther King Jr. rose to prominence, he was tapping into the collective unconscious field of the human desire for equity and justice. It touched something deep, not just within the African American community, but within the whole worldwide community. There was a universal peace that he was tapping into. At the same time, he was operating within the fields of fear and oppression that had existed in the South for years and years. And so as King chose to tap into the deeper waters of universal compassion, what that did was that gave his followers the choice of whether they would tap into that deeper river or remain enmeshed in the more localized field of fear. And at that point, it was choice. In the quote that I read today, the things that King was talking about were choices that he made to overcome fear and abuse and brutality with love. It was a choice. And see, I think the same kind of thing was happening when Jesus delivered the Sermon on the Mount. As he spoke to thousands of people there, he tapped into the deeper waters of the unconscious field of his listeners. These were people who were oppressed not only by Roman foreigners, but also by their very own countrymen and religious leaders. And as Jesus spoke, he tapped into that deep stream of life that spoke of value and worth and recognition and love and justice. And that resonated. That resonated. That brought that up to consciousness for his listeners. And in a sense, let that field loose. One of the powerful things about Jesus, and the same thing can be said of Buddha and Muhammad and a host of other spiritual leaders, is that he set a field into motion. And like a snowball that gained momentum and has carried on through the centuries. That deep stream of consciousness was brought to the surface, was brought to awareness. And in the intervening years has become like an artesian spring of life feeding the whole earth. And my point here is that each of us here is like one of those birds in the flock. Except, hopefully, we have more consciousness. And we have more of a capacity for choosing, for choice. We have more of a capacity for creating. I'd like to suggest that each of you is like a wave in the ocean, unique and individual, and yet in no way separated from the larger body. The fact seems to be that individuality is both a reality and an illusion at the same time. I mean, who of us here wasn't raised within the context of family? Who of us here wasn't raised within the context of a culture? Who of us here, we had parents that taught us, for good or for ill. But they shaped us into the energetic beings that we have become. We've lived within a culture, we've lived within a world that in like manner has done that same kind of shaping and molding. It's true that we've each put our own stamp on that. Yet, in our independence, we are totally dependent. Paradox. David Steindl-Rast, the wonderful Benedictine monk I met a couple of years ago, puts it nicely in his book on gratitude. He catches a line of an E.E. Cummings poem, who wrote, "I am through you, so I. I am through you, so I." We only have our being in response to those around us, through those around us. In our love relationships, in our intimacy, we become who it is that we are. As we build up walls in our relationships, as we tear down walls in our relationships, we become who we are. We develop the muscles of our souls. We don't do it in isolation. No one is an island. Steindl-Rast adds his own comment to Cummings' line and says, "Not only am I through you so happy, so alive, but so I. Not only do I have my being through you, but my happiness, my aliveness, my I-ness. A couple of weeks ago, I spoke of Jesus' message of the divinity of each of us, of how he called people into their holiness, and how he didn't set himself above others, but welcomed those others as brothers and sisters into full participation in the sacred. And so I'd like to add to that this morning that the bottom line of what I'm suggesting here is that while it's true that you can say, I am God, it's also true that you can't say that unless you can also say, you are God. We are God. There is a deep stream in which we live, a deep field in which we live. It's the stream, it's the field, it's the realm of the hope of God. Peace and